we were asking that, we had discussed that which are the calcineurin inhibitors which prevent the T cell activation by working at this level. And you people had answered that it could be tacrolimus, it could be cyclosporin. And after that, I was just trying to tell you that there is a dynamics of T cell activation which works like that. Initially you have CD40 ligand getting expressed, which is a co-stimulatory molecule. Then you get IL-2, and then you get IL-2 receptor, because the IL-2 which is produced has to act, generally acts in an autocrine fashion. It acts on the IL-2 receptor on the same cell and causes proliferation. And proliferation occurs because there is increase in DNA synthesis. So we have molecules which we can use for T cell, decreasing T cell activation. You can use generic drugs like which block DNA synthesis. Like what? Anybody can name a drug which blocks DNA synthesis? Because if you don't speak, then I don't know, are you people there or not?
Azathioprine,
cyclophosphamide, methotrexate. So these are drugs which we use for blocking DNA synthesis. So there are drugs which act at the IL-2 receptor. So you have antibodies to IL-2 receptor. You can also block IL-2. IL-2 is difficult to block, but you can have drugs which decrease IL-2 production, which are basically cyclosporine, tacrolimus. These reduce the amount of IL-2 production. Okay, let's move forward. We have lots to do today. So what I was saying was, in this slide, what we are trying to show you is that depending on what the microbe is, you will get the kind of cell T activation of cells which is needed for that kind of immune response. So if you get infection with a fungus is recognized by this pattern recognition receptor, which is called dectin or TLRs, and this will lead on to production of IL-6 and 23. So this will be the third signal in case you have a fungal infection. And that will cause production of cells which will be Th17 cells. That means they will produce lots of IL-17. And we know for fungal immune response, IL-17 is a very, very important cytokine. So children who are born with IL-17 deficiency, they get chronic mucocutaneous candidiasis. If you have infection with helminths, which are recognized predominantly by TLR1 and 2, the antigen presenting cell will produce interleukin 10. So that will be the third signal for this T cell activation, and that will cause the cell to move into a Th2 phenotype, which will produce IL-4, IL-5, IL-30. Similarly, if you have bacteria, there they are recognized, as we said, by LPS in TLR4, they will cause more production of IL-12, which will skew this T cell towards a Th1 cell, which will produce interferon gamma. So because that is how the immune response is directed. So it's a balance or a complex interaction between the microbe, the type of microbe, the tumor, the burden of the microbe, the kind of antigen presenting cell, is it a mature dendritic cell or an immature dendritic cell, which decides the fate of the T cell, that what it becomes. So now coming to CD8 cells, if you see in this diagram, Listeria is an intracellular pathogen. So in an intracellular pathogen, if you take this mice and infect with Listeria, if you give them non-immune T cell, you transfer non-immune T cell, the burden of this Listeria monocytogenes goes on increasing. But if you transfer immune T cells to this mice, the Listeria doesn't grow. So that means T cells provide protective immunity against Listeria monocytogenes. In contrast, if you give serum from an immunized mice, it has no effect. So the antibodies are not protective against Listeria monocytogenes. So what happens is, you have this cell which has an intracellular pathogen like Listeria. The CD8 T cell will bind to it, will recognize the antigen in context with MHC class 1. Once it recognizes in context with MHC class 1, it will release certain granules, and these granules are going to cause damage to the cell, and the cell will die. When the cell dies, the bacteria also dies. So this is what the release happens. So these granules in the CD8 cells as well as in natural killer cell contain two things, which is one is perforin and the other is the enzyme, that is enzyme. So released, the perforin polymerizes on the target cell and it forms a pore, and through this pore goes the enzyme, that is the granzyme, and this granzyme further causes more problems. Alternatively, the granzyme can also bind to a receptor on the cell surface and it can go inside. Granzyme is a highly toxic enzyme. It can cause killing of the cell. And these are the mechanism by which it causes killing. So when you have granzyme, it causes cleavage of a protein which leads on to activation of the mitochondria. And this mitochondrial activation lead on to release of cytochrome C. And we all know that cytochrome C is one of the most important mediator of mitochondria mediated apoptosis of the cells. Similarly, the granzyme can also cause caspase activation. And caspases are another enzymes which cause nuclear fragmentation and cell death via apoptosis. Now the question arises that why are the normal cells not killed? Because if you are releasing these granules, the other cells in the vicinity should also get killed. But it's a very regulated process, and what happens is that the cell to cell contact is perfect. So that this is a cell which is infected or which has got malignancy, and this is your CD8 cell. The CD8 cell will release this granule in this cleft, and the perforin will polymerize and will cause the granzyme to enter. So no cells in the vicinity can get damaged. And as you see here, these granules also need to move to the membrane. So people have shown that if you have defects in any of these processes, you can have problems, as we will see later. The other advantage is that other question is why the CD8 cell doesn't get killed. The CD8 cell does not get killed because as soon as it releases its content, the perforin goes and polymerizes in the opposite cell, because it is being released from this side, it just immediately polymerizes, and the CD8 cell immediately after that dissociates and it can go back. It can kill another target cell. So this way it saves two things. One, it prevents its own killing, and second, it can kill multiple cells. It's not like neutrophil that once it goes and does it work, it dies off. So it can be recycled. So we are all aware of the disease which we are seeing in COVID-19, that is hyperinflammation, or what we see in our clinics, macrophage activation syndrome.
I have a doubt, ma'am.
Yes.
I may ask. Yes, ma'am. You said about the recycling of the CD8 T cell. So how exactly does that happen? Just the polymerization of this perforin, that is it, ma'am, or is there anything else?
No. So if you see here, this is the CD8 cell. It has released its granules. We want killing of this infected cell. So the infected cell, this perforin will immediately go and bind on the cell membrane of the opposite cell and will polymerize, will form a hole. Through the hole that this yellow thing, which is the granzyme, will go, because it does not want that the hole should form in the killer CD8 cell also, because it can go this side also. No? So once it releases and it immediately dissociates. Once it dissociates, one, it prevents its own killing. The second, it can now again go and kill another infected cell. No, so it is beneficial for the body that the same CTL can kill many cells and it does not get killed by the perforin mechanism. So this is what happens in macrophage activation syndrome. One, people have shown that the patients who get macrophage activation syndrome or hyperinflammation have some genetic predisposition for macrophages to be hyperactivated, that even with small stimuli, their macrophages produce more cytokines. Second, as I showed you, that you need the CD8 cells and the NK cell to cause killing of the virus infected cell. And for that, we need this cytolytic machinery, that is granzyme, perforin, and the machinery to move these granules to the periphery. So you have diseases which we call as familial hemophagocytic syndromes, where there is a defect in the cytolytic pathway. This will cause a defective killing of the virus infected cell. Sometimes the viruses itself can induce a transient defect in the cytolytic pathway, either because of high levels of cytokine being produced, or some viruses have this tendency by themselves. And once there is a defect in the cytolytic pathway, the virus infected cell continuously keeps on producing interferon gamma if there is an infection of T cell, or if it is infection of the macrophages, it produces IL-6, IL-1, TNF alpha, which further activates the T cell, and this loop keeps on happening. And this is the loop which leads on to the cytokine storm. And it is important to remember that because this is a loop between macrophage and CD8 cells, macrophage and NK cell, it happens only with intracellular pathogens. So macrophage activation syndrome is seen in patients with viral infections, tuberculosis, leishmania, malaria, but not with E. coli infection or with basically Pseudomonas. So gram-negative infections rarely cause it, except in Salmonella. People have shown that patients who have salmonellosis or typhoid can get it because Salmonella is also an obligate intracellular pathogen. So it can stay in the intracellular area. So it can also cause macrophage activation syndrome. And we are using drugs like interleukin 6 blocker like tocilizumab, interleukin 1 blocker like anakinra for patients with hyperinflammatory syndrome. Now, once we have looked at what the T cell, how the T cell response is generated, let's see how the B cell response is generated. We said that the B cell can recognize the whole microbe because it is recognizing by the antibody. Antibody recognizes conformations. And once the antibody binds to the microbe, it will cause signal transduction through the surrogate molecules that are present in the vicinity, which is, we don't need to remember, but they have kinase domains which cause activation. And these activation through ERK pathway or NF-kappa B pathway cause activation of B cell. So if you see, whenever the B cell gets activated, three things can happen, as was happening in partly in the T cell. One is there is proliferation, because you want same kind of B cells to be produced which can recognize that microbe. Second, this activated B cell now starts expressing multiple cytokine receptors as well as co-stimulatory molecules. We know that whenever you have co-stimulatory molecules, you get better activation. Third, that this B cell, initial B cell, all naive B cell have IgM receptor on its surface. So they get converted to plasma cells and they start producing IgM. So we are all aware that in early infection, we always get IgM antibodies. So if you have IgM antibodies, we say it means that there has been a recent infection, while IgG antibodies occur later in the course of disease. And this is where the helper T cell and B cell interact. I showed you that the antigen is carried by the antigen presenting cell to the lymph node. First, it activates the CD4 cell. The CD4 cell becomes effector T cell, or then it migrates to the area which is around the lymphoid follicle, which is the B cell area. So in the vicinity of the B cell area, the B cell and the T cell interact. So this T cell is called the T follicular helper cell because it is helping follicular B cells and it is a T cell. So this help is most important and this causes lots of things to happen, as we will see soon. So once this T cell gives help to the B cell, and plus, as I said, that the co-stimulatory signals also happening between T cell and B cell of CD40 and CD40 ligand, and also there are cytokine release both from B and T cell. Depending on what the cytokine is, if there is nothing, then this will be only producing IgM. If there is Th1 activation and there is a lot of IF and gamma around, then you will get IgG subclass antibodies formed. And we know that in secondary immune response, IgG is the most important antibodies which are important. If you have a lot of IL-4 formation, that is, there is more of Th2 response, like as happens in parasitic infections with allergens, then you will get IgE production. If you have a lot of TGF-beta in the vicinity, then you will get production of IgA. So it is end result of the help from the T cell and the kind of cytokines which are present that it will decide which kind of antibody forms. And we know that there's nothing absolute. In most diseases, most of these classes of antibodies are formed. It is just that what is predominant. So in a patient who has genetic defect in CD40 ligand, that is co-stimulatory molecule, they cannot produce IgG, IgA or IgE. They produce only mainly IgM. So that gives rise to a disease called hyper IgM syndrome. That is, they just produce IgM. So this shows that this co-stimulatory signal is very important for production of other types of antibodies. So this is what we are showing, that in total the B cell immune response means first you have a naive B cell which is IgM and IgD positive, meets the microbe, and this you have activated B cell which gets help from the T cell, you get lots of B cell proliferation, and then either you have antibody secretion or there is change from IgM to other class of antibodies, and there is another thing which happens, that in the B cell follicle gradually you get a lot of mutations happening, like what we are seeing mutations happening in coronavirus. So the mutations generally get, and the selection process also happens in the B cell follicle. In coronavirus, the mutations which are giving advantage to the virus for persistence or for increased infectivity are getting selected. Similarly, in the B cell follicle in the lymph node, what happens is that you have random mutations happening, and you get different types of antibody being formed. The antibody which can bind with very high affinity, with very high contact with the microbe gets selected. So as our immune response matures, we get better and better antibody. And that is what is called the affinity maturation process of the antibody. And obviously, some cells stay in the body as memory B cells, so that when we have next encounter, we can be better prepared. This cartoon I had shown you day before yesterday, that we have 5 different kinds of immunoglobulins, IgG, E, D. IgG is the most predominant and most abundant, and then you have IgA, then you have IgM, there is a small amount of IgE and a very, very small amount of IgD in circulation. So if you see, what do these antibodies do? These antibodies can be neutralizing antibodies which can neutralize the microbe. They can bind to the phagocytes with the Fc receptor, because with the Fab fragment they are binding to the microbe, but with the Fc fragment they can bind to the phagocyte, and the phagocyte can take up this microbe and kill the microbe. Then you can have that it can bind to the NK cell, and we know that NK cell is a cytotoxic cell, it will kill the infected cell. It can also be that we know that antibodies activate complement, especially the classical pathway of complement. So this complement action will cause that there will be complement products formed. So if there is C3b deposited on the microbe, it can bind to the phagocyte on the C3b receptor. That's how the phagocytosis of these microbes happen, when they are coated with the complement fragments. Or during the complement activation, we have C3a generation, C5a generation, which gives rise to pro-inflammation. That is, it increases the vascular permeability, it causes the cells to come in. So C5a is supposed to be one of the very potent and pro-inflammatory molecule. And finally, as we saw for the CD8 cell, that they can plug holes. Similarly, when you have membrane attack complex formed of the complement, that can plug holes into the microbe, and the microbe can die because of lysis. So antibodies have multitude of function. This is showing you the dynamics, that how antibody response matures over time. So if you see here that you have a antigenic challenge. Initially, you have naive B cell which is meeting the microbe. The B cell will proliferate. Some plasma cells will be formed which will predominantly produce IgM antibodies. Gradually, over time, you will get IgG antibodies formed. And because the stimulus is gone, gradually these will come down and you will get some memory cells staying in the body. If you get a re-challenge, this time, because we have the memory B cells, you will get very fast production of immunoglobulin G. Here it was happening around 12 to 13 days. Now it will happen at around 6 days. So this, and plus the magnitude of the antibody formed is higher than what you saw in the primary antibody response. This is much higher. So the secondary antibody response is more robust, is more fast, plus it produces antibodies which have high affinity. And once the challenge is gone, gradually again it will come back to its normal self. But if you see, even the baseline goes little higher. So there are much more memory B cell if you keep on having repeated exposures. So let's just revise that what happens in some common infections, and all of us are so obsessed with coronavirus nowadays. So let's take that as the first example. So we know that SARS-CoV-2 infects the respiratory epithelium. So this is the virus. It is taken up by the alveolar macrophages. It comes to the draining lymph node, where what I showed you happens, that it activates T cell, it activates B cell, and these activated T cells migrate to the alveoli. If they are able to look after the virus and kill the virus, we don't get much of disease, or we get very mild disease. But if we get overwhelming immune response, that you have lots of these cells coming into it, the monocytes, the neutrophils, the T cells, so they cause damage to the alveolar membrane, cause hyaline membrane production, cause fibrosis, because there are lots of activated T cells that are producing cytokines like IL-6, GM-CSF, IL-1 from the macrophages. So this is what is happening in severe COVID pneumonia, that you get fibrosis and you get a ground glassing. So people have shown that in SARS-CoV-2 infection, we are generating all the different kinds of adaptive immunity. We have helper T cell, we have regulatory T cell, we have CD8 T cells, we also get antibodies formed. And if you see that the antibodies which form, we don't know how long do they last, but at least we know that they are there for about 4 to 6 months. You also generate specific T cells, which come down, but probably persist for life, probably. We have data for about 6 months period available in literature now. And similarly, you have memory B cells persisting. So this was a question asked by somebody yesterday, that what happens, how is the immune response to neurotropic viruses generated? So if you see here in the brain, I had responded that we have a very good, a tight blood-brain barrier. And this is your neuron. The counterpart of antigen presenting cell is a microglial cell, and you have the astrocytes. So if you have infection with a neurotropic virus, it will infect the neuron. Once it infects a neuron, the neuron itself has a capability of producing certain chemokines and interferon. So once it produces, because neuron also has TLR. So as I told you earlier, that if you activate TLR 3, 5, 7, you will get type 1 interferon response. And this type 1 interferon response activates the microglia. It also activates the astrocytes. And once the microglia gets activated, they produce pro-inflammatory cytokines, which act on the endothelium and cause upregulation of the. So this is a neurotropic virus thing. So because somebody had asked me a question regarding neurotropic viruses. So if you see this is the neuron, the green one. This is a microglia, which is the antigen presenting cell, and this is the astrocyte. So normally the blood-brain barrier is very strict, so very few cells actually enter the brain. There are very few cells. But when you have a neurotropic virus which infects a neuron, the neurotropic virus binding to the TLRs can cause production of interferon, type 1 interferons and some chemokines. These will activate the microglia and the astrocytes. They will produce these pro-inflammatory cytokines and chemokines, which will cause lot of integrins on the blood-brain barrier, on the endothelial cells, because there is a lot of these molecules now getting expressed which attract the immune cells to come through and come into the brain. And once these come into the brain, they will cause production of local antibody. They will have T cells which can kill the virus infected neurons. So this is how the neurotropic viruses generate an immune response. And sometimes, like you see, some of the RNA viruses stay for years, and some of the DNA viruses stay for years in the brain. Like herpes, if you have infection zoster, so they stay in the neurons. So this is a long-term control. So you have a balance. There is some low-grade inflammation which keeps these neurons, these viruses which are inside RNA, and keeps them under control. But if you have immunosuppressive state or something else happens, then these viruses can get reactivated. So this is what happens in tuberculosis. So in tuberculosis, because it is infecting again comes through the respiratory tract, it infects the alveolar cells. Once they get infected, they cause again activation of the TLRs and other things, which cause activation of the macrophage, and similar kind of immune response is generated. But here, if you see that the three important cytokines for generation of granuloma are IL-2, IFN gamma, and TNF. So if you get good, robust T cell response, then you will get a very well-formed granuloma, which will be that you have inside macrophage, which contains the mycobacteria. Then you have these lymphocyte color, the macrophages forming macrophages, and then you have the lymphocytes. But if you have any defects that you don't generate a robust T cell response, or you have deficiency of TNF, like in patients who have received anti-TNF therapy, there the granulomas are not well formed. The Mycobacterium tuberculosis can disperse out, and patients can have active tuberculosis, local or disseminated. So normally, most of the time, all of us have some amount of latent infection, which is kept under check by a robust immune response in healthy individuals. So I hope you can hear me. Now I'm getting scared. So I hope
Yes,
you
ma'am,
can hear
audible,
me.
ma'am.
Okay, so I have to ask every 10 minutes. Otherwise, I'll keep on going. So the helminths, as I showed, generate a very different response. So they generated Th2 response. I showed you the previous diagram that when helminths cause, you get lot of production of from the antigen presenting cell. There is some IL-6, but there is a lot of IL-10 being produced. So this causes skewing towards the Th2 cells, and this Th2 cell produce IL-5. IL-5 is a very important cytokine for eosinophils. So the eosinophils produce lot of chemicals from these granules like eosinophil chemotactic factor, elastase, which will cause killing of the worm. Similarly, it also causes the B cell to produce IgE antibodies. And these IgE antibodies bind to mast cell and basophils. And these cause mast cell degranulation. And once a mast cell degranulate, they again release lots of chemicals, which are highly toxic to the helminths. And that's how the helminths get killed. But what I was saying was that helminths are also good for us, because helminths also generate a lot of T regulatory cells, which produce IL-10, TGF, beta. They also generate a lot of B regulatory cells. The B cells also have regulatory B cells, which again produce IL-10. And they also cause skewing of the macrophages to M2 macrophages, anti-inflammatory macrophages. So this is why people believe that in communities where there's a lot more helminth infection, where people live in not in a very clean environments, they are less likely to get infections with organism which elicit a need a good this kind of a response. So Th1 response. So viruses, so maybe viral infections are much less in them. Maybe this is the reason why we are having less severe COVID infection, because we have a lot more of T regulatory cells. So we are not having a lot of hyperinflammation. Okay, so we have discussed how a T cell response is generated, a B cell response is generated, and I told you earlier that we can't have unregulated immune response. Otherwise, there will be a lot of collateral damage and we will get tissue injury. So to prevent that, what we have is that normally we have signal 1 and signal 2. That is, you have MHC TCR and you have CD8086. But here, if you have another signal, this is a signal this is another molecule which binds to CD28. So what happens is when the immune response needs to be down modulated, instead of CD80 getting expressed on the antigen presenting cell, we have CTLA4 gets expressed on the antigen presenting cell. As the burden of the microbes come down, as the inflammatory milieu becomes less, the antigen presenting cell starts expressing CTLA4. And this gives a negative signal to the T cell. So the T cell response gets dampened. So we have many signals. So if you see here, some of them are stimulatory, some of them are inhibitory. So these are the inhibitory molecules. Some of them you must be knowing PD1. We know of checkpoint inhibitors. So PD1, CTLA4, TIM3. So these are all negative regulators. So they will inhibit the T cell response, while these are positive stimulator to T cell, like T cell receptor, CD28, CD40 ligand interaction, OX40, OX40 ligand. So they stimulate the T cell. Yes, you have a question?
नहीं,
Hello, does anybody have a question?
मनोज पेशेंट को
Can you
कहीं
please
और
put
भेज
off
देना,
your mics?
कहीं
Please
और
put
पे ले
off
लो.
your mic. Excuse me. Somebody is speaking.
Sorry,
Can you
ma'am.
please
Sorry,
put off
sir.
your mic? Yeah. So what I was telling you that you have co-stimulatory molecules which can serve inhibitory function also. So when we want to regulate the immune response, the T cell as well as the antigen presenting cell starts expressing these inhibitory molecules so that we don't have unregulated immune response and cause tissue damage. So I think people who are in malignancy area who work in tumor biology would know about checkpoint inhibitors. The checkpoint inhibitors are nothing but inhibitors which decrease the inhibitory signal, because as you know, in malignancy, what do we want? We want a robust T cell response, and these inhibitory molecules are preventing a robust immune response. So we have antibodies which can bind to these inhibitory molecules. So CTLA4 is an inhibitory molecule. If you have antibody to CTLA4, it will block this and you will get stimulation of the T cell, and this stimulated T cell will now go and kill the tumor cell. Similarly, we know that PD1 and PDL1, the ligand 1, these are molecules which are inhibitory molecules. So if you have antibodies to these can be given to patients, they will remove this inhibition and cause activation of the T cell, which will again cause anti-tumor effect. So this is how the checkpoint inhibitors work, by blocking the inhibitory signals. So we have realized in the last 1 year that we are not smart enough. The microbe is even smarter than us. The microbes try to evade the immune response, and they have. I am just giving you some of the examples. So a lot of viruses change their antigen, and that is what we are now seeing for SARS-CoV-2 also. It's best known for influenza. That is why we need to make Fluvac almost every year with the new strain. This also happens in bacteria, but to a certain lesser degree, like Neisseria, Salmonella. They can also change their antigenic structure so that the antibody is not able to neutralize the microbe. Some of the microbes can produce products which will enable the complement activation. They will degrade the complement products. So the complement activation then cannot kill the microbe. There are others which are resistant to phagocytosis, that they just can't be phagocytosed, either because of a very slimy coat or because of certain chemicals on its surface. There are microbes which produce things which can negate the effect of toll-like receptors. So the microbes are much more intelligent than all of us. Now the final thing is, whenever we have an encounter or when we develop an immune response, we also generate memory. So I hope you are there.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, you are right.
Otherwise, I'll keep on speaking. So this is how a memory generation happens. So you have an initiation of an immune response by antigen being presented to the T cell. The T cell is proliferating in response of IL-12. Then you have other cytokines which are helping this T cell to proliferate even more. And as the time passes by, there is contraction. The contraction happens because the cells which are hyperproliferative gradually starts dying. And once they start dying, then these are the pink ones are the memory cells, because the effector cells have a shorter lifespan, they die off faster, and the memory T cells have a much longer lifespan. They are more resistant to death. And the two cytokines which are very, very important for memory maintenance are IL-7 and IL-15. So these two cytokines keep these cells at a low grade proliferation. And you know that if you have varicella in childhood, you are protected against second bout for all your life, be it 70 years, 80 years. So it shows that the memory T cells can persist for decades and sometimes for the whole lifespan of the individual. And this maintenance is probably being done. So there are two hypotheses. One is that these memory T cells which are generated, they are totally being maintained by these cytokines. The other theory is that maybe there is some small amount of antigen which stays in some antigen presenting cells, which keep on presenting to these memory T cells and keep a low grade proliferation to keep on happening. But these are very difficult experiments to prove. So if you see here that you have a primary response, pathogen has come, its immune response has been generated, and the activated cells have gone to the periphery. In the secondary response, you have mainly the memory cells. The memory cells which were there, they will take part. And as we saw for antibodies, similarly for the, if a microbe needs the T cells to be activated, it will be activated much faster. So having a memory is always good. So this is what we had seen for antibody, and this is again showing you that in the secondary response, the antibody response is more robust and much faster. So the B cell memory is maintained predominantly in the lymph node. So in the lymph node, in the follicle, the memory B cells persist. And here it is believed that the memory B cells persist because these are very special kind of dendritic cells, the follicular dendritic cells in the follicles, that they keep the antigen on its surface for long years. And these keep on giving a low grade stimulus to the memory B cell to keep on proliferating. So we can also induce memory by vaccines, and we have different kinds of vaccines available. So we have live attenuated vaccine like BCG, you have live attenuated viral vaccines like polio, and subunit vaccines. It could be which could be toxoid like tetanus, or it could be a hepatitis B surface antigen. You have conjugate vaccines, which are supposed to give, because it's a carbohydrate hemophilus vaccine. So if you add a peptide moiety, it gives you better vaccine. Or you have viral vectors, which are being nowadays used. So can somebody give an example of a viral vector-based vaccine? So what are you getting nowadays for your vaccination for COVID-19?
For COVID-19, it is a viral vaccine.
Adenoviral vector.
Adenoviral
Adenoviral
vector.
vector.
Yeah, so it's a chimpanzee adenovirus,
Chimpanzee
which is being
adeno.
used as a viral vector. Or you can have DNA vaccines. So there are lots of DNA vaccines also which are under trial. So this is, I just thought I will show you that you can have DNA and RNA vaccines. Nowadays, they had never been used earlier, but in COVID-19 is the first time in the history of mankind that we're using RNA vaccines. So RNA vaccines are very easy and quick to design, because to make a polynucleotide chain is not difficult, but it had never been done before. But they have shown a great success. And to have a 95% efficacy is amazing for any vaccine. You can have live attenuated vaccine, which is basically nothing but you have made the virus very weak. So it can proliferate, but it will not cause disease. The only problem in this is that it can revert back. Or in a patient who's immunocompromised, it can cause a lot of proliferation. So you may have some low-grade disease. The other way is that you can kill the virus by chemicals, so that the antigen persists, but the virus cannot multiply. So these are safe, but the problem is that it may not induce as good a response. But inactivated virus vaccines have been used in previously also. You can have subunit vaccine like hepatitis B surface antigen. Similarly, people are trying to make spike protein based vaccines. Then you have the viral vectors. So the viral vectors we have seen, again, a very effective thing. The only problem is that if I already have an immunity to this viral vector which is being used, like adenovirus, I may have had an adenoviral infection earlier, then my pre-existing memory to the adenoviral virus will destroy this, and then it will not be effective. So that is why now people are thinking that maybe the Sputnik people have done better. They have used two different adenoviral vectors for the dose 1 and the second dose. So that is what the Oxford people are also trying to give, one dose of the Chidox vaccine and the second dose of the Sputnik vaccine, so that you have two different vectors and you don't have pre-existing immunity probably to two different vectors. So this is what is happening here. We can leave that. And as I showed you that mRNA vaccines have really proven us right, highly efficacious. We are left with allergens. So the allergens are a very different cup of tea. So it is the same antigen, which sometimes causes disease, and in certain individuals it doesn't cause disease at all. So allergen, if you get first exposure, you never get a disease. Because for the allergen, first it has to induce an IgE antibody response. So the allergen is seen by the B cell. The B cell can present the antigen to the T cell, and this time the T helper cell will be of which type? Somebody has to tell me. Allergen will cause which type of T helper cell to be formed?
2.
TH2
TH2.
cells. Yes, so because that will produce more of IL-4, and IL-4 is the one which causes the B cell to produce IgE. And this IgE molecule, so can everybody hear?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Somebody has written, can others
Yes,
hear?
ma'am.
I has written, that's why I was wondering if it has got lost again. So this IgE molecule which is produced goes and binds to the, this is a very different receptor. This is not the usual receptor which is present on the macrophages. So this is the Fc receptor for IgE. So it's Fc epsilon receptor, which is present mainly on the mast cell and the basophils. So what will happen is that IgE will bind to this receptor, and if it just keeps bound, nothing happens. So I may have had exposure to an allergen, I may have produced IgE antibodies, the IgE antibodies have got fixed to the mast cell, but till I have a second exposure, I have no symptoms. Once I get a second exposure, then this allergen will go inside my body and will cause cross-linking. So you need to have cross-linking of IgE by the allergen that will trigger the mast cell to degranulate. And you know that what I showed you, that the mast cells contain multiple granules which contain histamine, leukotrienes, and these chemicals cause smooth muscle contraction, cause platelet aggregation, cause pain, cause more eosinophils to come into the vicinity and release eosinophilic chemotactic factor and other proteases to cause tissue damage. And they also activate the mucus glands to produce lots of mucus. And that is why in bronchial asthma, you see those mucus plugs, you get bronchospasm, you get pain in your throat, and you have eosinophilia. So this, if somebody is interested, this is the intracellular events which happen when the allergen causes cross-linking. You get generation of cyclic AMP, and you have phospholipase C activation, and that causes these arachidonic acid pathway to be activated and leukotriene and prostaglandin production. And plus, there is activation of actin filaments, which cause these granules to go to the periphery and release. So these are the dynamics that you have initially, the cyclic AMP release, then you have the calcium intake going in, and then you have the production of histamine. So we always used to think that allergies are an acute phenomena, they come and go, but that's not so. And that is why the whole change has happened in the management of allergy disorders, especially for bronchial asthma. Previously, we used to use only beta agonists, antihistaminics, anti-leukotriene drugs like montelukast. But over the years, what we have understood is that it's not only the early response which happens. There is also something called a late response. And the late response is basically mediated by the inflammatory cells which cause tissue damage, which is most of it is through T cells. The T cells produce cytokines which cause recruitment of other inflammatory mediators, which lead on to damage to the bronchial mucosa and other things. So that is why nowadays the first line therapy in patients with bronchial asthma is what?
Corticosteroid.
Corticosteroids. So that we cause dampening of the immune response, not just treat the end result, that is histamine release and all. So this is my first talk.